everyone, I'm Sumit Bose. Welcome to this podcast, which will be across Future Net Zero and Energy Live News. Today, I'm joined by the wonderful and very brilliant Rosa Rotko, who is the Energy Transformation Specialist from Mott MacDonald. Rosa, hello, how are you?
Hi there, good to be here. Thank you, Sumit.
You've done a survey with us, which we're going to go through and explain to the viewers and listeners what you're doing. But just for people who don't know you, explain what Mott MacDonald does, because it's probably a name a lot of companies have heard of, but probably not too sure where you sit in the energy space.
Yeah, sure. Mott MacDonald is a global engineering and management consultancy, UK headquartered. We've got 20,000 staff across the world. We're one of the largest employee-owned companies, actually, similar to that sort of John Lewis style. But we work with energy clients and large energy users, so everyone in the value chain, from everything from helping design and develop large nuclear power plants or large offshore wind farms or grid infrastructure, to then the large energy end users, manufacturing, data centers, ports, airports, water companies, and help design, plan, all sorts of energy assets and programs.
If you look at what your background is, which I think is very interesting, you've worked across the sector. So you've worked in government, you've sat in Bays, DEC, whatever it's called, DESNES, you've done all of those. You've also worked as a lawyer, and you've also worked for a big supplier. Before we go into kind of this survey, you've had a lot of different experiences. What do you think is going on now? Do you feel that this is, having seen this, are we really underway, especially with Labour now coming? Is this now supercharging our transition?
I'm not sure it is. It's still yet, and I always because, like you said, I used to be in DEC and Bays and in energy policies. I've got a bit of an inside track how things work, and it always I think it always depresses me how we sort of don't maximize the potential for driving change and driving good consumer outcomes, good business outcomes, and we leave value on the table. The government can be captured and lobbied, and
Yes.
people have busy jobs and they don't have time to make sense of how the markets work and how the regulation and policy works. So I think there's a lot more we could do as a society, as the industry, definitely as the government. So yeah, absolutely.
You did a survey with us, and if you've not seen it, go to Energy Live News, readers and viewers, and you'll be able to catch it there. And we'll go through some of that now. But why did you want to do this survey in the first place? Was it really because this change of government, or what was the reason for doing it now?
Yeah, so this reflects our work with large energy end users. There could be ports, airports, water companies, data centers, so on. And the one thing we find that these kind of large energy users are increasingly becoming like energy companies or mini developers, and they've got lots of different assets and high energy bills, and they've got quite a complex mini energy systems on their sites. But at the same time, they are completely underrepresented in the energy policy making and that conversation, because government and policymakers tend to focus so much on big centralized kit. And if you sort of look at any policy papers, even the recent budget, you see a lot more focus on large assets and large grids and things. And there's always lacking of anything that's more decentralized, distributed side, large energy users, and that side. And it feels like governments systematically failing to properly engage with that part of the market. And we see now that it's just more and more becoming an issue, because energy bills are going so expensive. And also these kind of companies are engaging in all aspects of the energy system now. So we just thought that there's a sort of gap in bringing these conversations together, and we work a lot in this space. So we thought now, and like you said, now it's the new government, so it's time to start the conversation fresh.
We did this survey, and we did it just before the budget, so that is a caveat to go, but people can explore it. But let's go through some of the major findings, and our audience was major large energy end users. So the people that normally watch and read our material, spending between 100,000 to sort of 100 million a year on energy. I suppose the biggest thing that struck me, and I wonder what your thought was, and it's pretty obvious. 71% of people expect prices to rise over the next 5 years or so. No real surprise there for you that energy pricing is such a major kind of issue, and also generally there's an acceptance that we're going to have to pay.
Yeah, absolutely no surprise there, and I find it quite interesting. Obviously, these people who responded, they are, like you said, they spend a lot of money on energy, and they do have professionals who follow the market and so on. So they all know that they're going to pay more and more over the course of this parliament and beyond. And it isn't matched by the government understanding of what's happening or the rhetoric, because all we hear is about cheap green energy and how everything the government do. There's always the kind of secure, affordable, green energy, and they're completely missing the point that none of this is cheap. We pay the highest electricity prices in the developed world, and they are just getting higher. So I think there's a complete sort of disconnect between what the industry knows is happening and what the ministers and officials are talking and saying. So I think that's something that needs to be realised.
I mean, if we delve in, and that was the headline figure, but if you sort of look at it, 45% believe there'll be a sort of increase of some form, and a further 25 or so, a significant increase. Looking at sort of digits, maybe double digits. Obviously, we don't know. We've got the new issues around employment costs that will fall on all businesses after the national insurance hike. We've got the cost of rolling out the net zero grid. I know that you'll be looking at this, but has Mark McDonald got an idea of how much you think prices might be going up by over the next 5 years as a percentage, or is it too difficult to say because you've got to have so many different factors coming in?
Yeah, so we're not in the business of forecasting the price, so we focus on the engineering and design aspects of projects. But you obviously, and your readers probably seen reputable companies like Cornwall Energy and others who do these forecasts, and they're obviously pointing also one way. So yeah, that's definitely an issue. And like you said there about the wider cost increases on businesses.
Yes.
I think it's underappreciated how much energy contributes to the inflation and the cost for everyone. And it's sort of like a vicious circle where we put all of the levies and social levies on the bills, which is essentially a tax, and then we add a VAT on top of the tax and then that energy cost feeds into every industrial process, household, business, and kind of so I think there's also not enough government emphasis in looking at how energy prices contribute to growth and how this kind of tax on tax in energy system then feeds into all our other costs. So that again is something I think government ought to consider and not just sit on this problem while it keeps getting worse.
The first thing that I suppose does give us a positivity, which I think is that the question we asked our readers in the survey: do you consider the energy transition and the drive to net zero will benefit your sector? Well, overwhelmingly, everyone agreed on that. Strongly agree. We had 45% and agree we had more than 40%. So you're looking about 85%. And that is a positive. That people do believe that going to net zero is good, not just for us as a planet, but good for our businesses and good for. Are you not surprised at that, or are you surprised?
So we did ask two questions. We asked whether the companies thought the transition benefited their sector, and whether it benefited them as a company.
Yes, and I've got that one as well.
What was surprising was that actually that massive majority thought that it both benefits them and their company. Because what we when we asked this question, we thought, let's ask two questions, because this might be the case where people think, oh, it's someone out there who gets the benefits. Like, I'm a loser, but someone out there is the winner. But actually, everyone felt that they were winners. So that
Yeah,
is
I mean,
definitely positive news.
you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. The figures are very, very similar, because the one about whether you think it would, benefit your sector, we're getting about 45% strongly agree, 40% saying agree. And will it benefit your company? Well, not too dissimilar, 43% saying strongly agree, and around about 35% saying agree. Do you think this is an attitudinal shift? Because we've seen what's happening, because we're all consumers. People, young generation are coming in, they want to buy greener, they want to buy cleaner. People can see, particularly after the pandemic, a lot of people saw what it was like to have clean, no streets, no pollution. So do you think this is now a real business shift in mindset, which is positive about this?
I do think there's that more and more positivity, and I think everyone, that's kind of the peer comparison. So we facilitate a lot of workshops across different sectors where we're looking at energy transformation, and I think there's that kind of, when people engage in peer learning and seeing that someone else is making business cases and getting investment for a new sort of project, and they sort of saying, oh well, hold on, that keeping up with the Joneses sort of thing. And yeah, so I think it's definitely positive, but that obviously doesn't mean that it's easy to implement these projects, or that it's easy to secure finance, which I know we'll talk about later as well. But at least, yeah, it looks like people are embracing the transition.
Let's talk about one of the things that, again, if people have watched the budget, I was finding it quite surprising, quite interesting actually. A push from the government on hydrogen. We asked a question about alternative fuels and grid connections, and 64% of our people surveyed wanted to see more deployment of low carbon fuels, particularly hydrogen and SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. What's your take on that? Because we'll talk about the grid, but it's quite interesting that people are looking at hydrogen as a bit of a player, because there's been a lot of negativity about hydrogen, and a lot of people saying that it has no role to play because of the costs. But I've always been quite an advocate of it. I just don't. Are you surprised at the kind of support it's got out there?
No, not at all. Because I think the negativity in the press around hydrogen as a technology comes from the sort of energy sector infighting between
Yes.
people who want to sort of support electrification, people who support hydrogen, different sort of heating solutions, fighting. And actually the topic that we're concerned here is not so much that argument within the energy sector around heat sources, but it's the fuels for transition for things like shipping, aviation, other industrial processes. And obviously hydrogen is already used as an industrial fuel. But generally what I saw when people said such a large majority of people want to see more support for low carbon fuels, is that a lot of our clients are doing that sort of future fuels planning, but they realize that they can't get very far in implementation on their own. And so whether the fuel that you're using in the future for shipping, aviation, or other transport or other processes, you need an infrastructure. Is it pipeline to your site? Is it brought in a tanker? Is there a storage site somewhere? And then it's obviously the availability of that fuel, at what price and where is it coming from? And all of those things are things that require central coordination and policy. So I think this is more, again, it's highlighting a pinch point that if the government really wants to see growth in this area, they need to do more things that help sort of facilitate, connect that ecosystem, like whether you support clusters to do this, whether you support the low carbon fuel planning, or anything that kind of helps drive it. And the other part of this conundrum for obviously aviation and shipping is the fact that you need the fuel infrastructure in both ends of the corridor.
Yes.
And the government is doing some green ports trials and things, but they're still very green corridor trials, but they're still very sort of small compared to the numbers of different routes that you have to connect up. And again, that's very hard for the private sector to go individually in every port, connect with every port and say, so have you got this? Have you got this? And yeah, definitely that's somewhere where more central coordination and even funding for those central pieces is what's required.
What struck me, and I don't know if it's used, that there is a narrative, and you know, we've always believed you need a real mix, right, to get us to zero. But there is a narrative which is just electrification is the only way, and batteries are the only way. This is very interesting that our, you know, our end users are smarter than that. They realise there are some areas where you're going to need fuels. You're going to need to continue to use fuels, and they'll be cleaner rather than that full. Does that surprise you? Because if you, like you said, it is the energy sector talking itself and having wars with itself, when really the end goal is for all of us to just reduce emissions. But there seems to be some battle lines drawn, definitely if you look on social media, which is there's only one way to reduce them, which is electrification. And yet our survey is showing that people are still considering fuels as a pathway to that. Does that surprise you?
It's a war between people who have an interest as well in pushing different solutions, and that's always going to be the case. But there is obviously already in any sort of area we use multiple. You know, you go to put fuel in your car. You've got a choice between petrol and diesel. It's not that you know, that's already a choice. Heating, even although we've got, you know, over 90% of domestic is on gas boilers, but we have heat networks and direct electric heating, storage heating. We already have. So I think it's a false idea that we ever need to try and convince everyone that we're 100% one or the other. I think there already is a mix of transport fuels, a mix of heating solutions, and that will continue. There's no, so that it's a false premise that we need to choose one winner. It's obviously a bit of market and a bit of policy about which technology is better. But say for ports, for example, ports are already diversified based on they already in a certain location where there's only certain type of vessel can get there, depending on how deep it is, how wide the channel is. And then we need to look at what that type of vessel needs in terms of fuel. So it's no good for the energy sector to be trying to dictate that, because there's lots of other, you know, that vessel is what size it is, where it can go, and what's the best. And so there's an aspect of technology, multiple components that will dictate the best fuel for different uses. And lots of hybrids emerging as well, where they use one fuel to get to their destination and then maybe connect to electricity to run at shore power on the port. So hybrids as well.
I do think it's you know, and I do the podcast and speak to lots of different people. I think that there is quite a funny thing, which is people are making up their mind to be fuel agnostic, and you know, they just want the right thing for the right situation to get them there. The second part of that question was interesting, and this one, I know we speak a lot to people at the grid, but half of respondents, 59%, said they want to see speedier connections, particularly for large users. I mean, this is pretty obvious. We've had a lot of kind of blockages. No big surprise there either, really, is there?
No, there's no surprise in the fact that the grid connection queue is long, but what's maybe underappreciated is the impact on the economy for this part. So normally we talk about grid connections for large projects to connect, and so that's the energy system piece. Whereas this end, we're talking about large users needing to connect, and that's an impact on whether you can grow other businesses or decarbonize other sectors. So the example I just said about ports, that if you, at the moment, if you've got a whatever cruise liner or a container ship sat at the port and they're running all their operations from a sort of fossil fuel, that's a big, you know, carbon impact and air quality impact. But for that cruise ship to be able to connect to a shore power connection, that needs a massive grid connection. So it's a sort of enabler. If that's not there, it's not possible to. So that's sort of a different problem to adding an extra offshore wind farm next to one that's already there. So which both problems need to be solved. And the other thing is development planned and development projects. So manufacturing, and obviously the previous government announced multiple free ports and investment zones where they try to be internationally competitive and attract manufacturing to certain areas. And this new government's continuing to support those zones. But again, if I was an international investor and I'm looking at where to locate my plant for manufacturing anything, whether that's steel or cars or who knows what, AI operations, then obviously, if I have to wait 10 years to connect, then that makes certain sites unviable to start with. And then obviously once I connect, if the price is the world's most highest electricity price, then that's another problem. So I think what's underappreciated is the effect on growth that this grid connection poses for end users. And so that is definitely something, again, I think government could look at, and National Grid and others could look at how they prioritize these sort of sectors where it's essential, sort of, I would say airports and ports and these international free ports and other sites. I think that would definitely be valuable exercise.
Before we go, let's look at finance, which is we talked about energy prices already, so we'll move over that one. There was an interesting question about what are you doing to reduce the energy impact, and the first thing, which is I think is very, very positive. 77% of people are looking at energy efficiency for buildings, which you would have thought is an old hat thing, but it's clearly not. And then also 60% we're looking at on-site generation and storage becoming these, I hate the term, but prosumers, have it behind the meter. There's shifting prices, 17%, and there's IT solutions. But those two big ones, let's discuss those. Energy efficiency measures, 77% are looking to do that. I'm surprised because people would say, well, we've known about this for the last 15, 20 years, LED light bulbs, insulation, but it's still a major thing for these big users.
Not at all surprised. So we run a lot of energy demand management program type activity. So we started off saying these energy users spend up to £100 million a year. So even if you shave 5% off or 10% off, it's massive. And we said everyone expects the prices to go to increase. So what has happened is that with energy prices going up, the business cases for different measures have become easier to put forward, and that sort of tipped the activity over because it suddenly makes more sense. Your payback period is a lot faster when the energy price is so high. So absolutely, and there is I think there's a difference between obviously what the energy sector has known needs to happen and then what maybe, say, like a water company has been able to implement, because obviously they are, again, like a regulated entity. And so there's still a lot more to do for companies to implement these programs. So absolutely.
And then the other point about, 60% odd looking at on-site generation. Now, I am very surprised at.
Yeah. So I think it's the first time I've seen that statistic said out loud. Again, I'm not surprised because we're inundated with people looking at this.
Right.
And the reason is because it is people trying to help themselves. And this is an acknowledgement that the government and central grid and energy policy is failing anyone who needs energy in large quantities. And companies are looking at how they can cut out the grid and cut out the pricing that's being forced on them, the social levies, the levies, all of the things that are necessary that we need to do, but actually the large energy users, like many consumers, can't afford to pay. And this is the inflationary impact that we talked about. So people are looking at implementing microgrids for manufacturing and other uses and looking at how much renewables on storage could I get on my own land? So these are obviously companies with large pieces of land. How can I minimize what I consume from the central grid, and what price impact it will have? And a lot of the clients also look at forecasts of the non-commodity costs in the future. So what more levies are coming on bills as well, and they are looking at this as a way to cut out the policy impacts that are being leaped on the
Isn't that interesting that really you could have a situation? It's a bit like the EV right now. If you've got an EV and you don't pay the congestion charge in London or other big cities, you don't pay any road tax. Eventually, you'll have to, because the government's going to have to get revenue from somewhere. This is the consumer, the end user, saying, actually, the pricing is so high. I'd rather take, if I've got the land and I've got the ability to do it, the longer term view of investing in an asset that will then take away my need for the grid. That is quite interesting, isn't it? Because that has some connotations of how we're going to fund our system for the future if more people go behind the meter.
Yeah, absolutely, because obviously it has the knock-on impacts. The more levies are being put on the bills and the less people use, it has a knock-on effect. And we obviously see this in multiple other parts. I think obviously the volumes of energy that are being used, no one is going to cut out the
No,
grid
of course.
completely.
No.
But it's interesting to see that people are looking at how far could we go to cut out grid. So, if yeah, and yeah, I think that it's an interesting sort of signal from the market to the fact that the pricing isn't right and the frameworks aren't right.
Another thing that's not right is for those companies who are looking to do this is getting investment. So the question on investment was very interesting. So I'm not surprised at this. 2% said it was very easy to get money. And then we get 91, you get basically 60% saying it's difficult, and another sort of 12, 15% saying it's very difficult, and not easy is not much at all. So overwhelmingly, you've got difficulty or very, very difficult to get money. There is money out there. There are banks, institutions that have got flipping trillions, let alone billions. What is going wrong that the businesses, the major users who want this to try and transition, and I was speaking to a friend of mine who works in the city, and he said, our big problem is we're good at startup money, we're good at, someone's really massive, but in the middle, to help people with this transition finance, it's not happening. And that's an attitudinal thing. You're across various things at Mott MacDonald. You look at the finance world as well as the energy world. This one is quite damning, isn't it, really? This result?
Yeah, although I suspect that this one, because this question is asked at large energy users who are trying to get investment for energy assets, I think there is also sort of a human factor and a bit of a capability gap in pulling the projects and business cases together,
Right.
because we see this a lot. Obviously, these are non-energy companies building business cases for multiple different energy assets. And the nature of the energy market is that for any asset you need to quantify various stacked revenues from various market dynamics, and and you also so you need to be able to articulate to anyone sort of not just your wholesale energy price impact or reduction, but also if you're doing ancillary services or selling back to grid, is there a carbon pricing impact? Some companies have a kind of their internal cost of carbon, or say like water companies will have a regulatory commitment to reduce carbon. So quantify your carbon reduction impact, quantify any operational efficiencies and things like fleet maintenance and other things. So there's multiple things that need to be quantified and put together for the business case. And what we see is that practical difficulty. So a lot of our work with clients as well is helping build kind of government or local government or other funding business cases. So I suspect that it is a bit like what you say. There is money out there, but it's like accessing it and showing how this all stacks together.
Is that a bureaucracy problem? Is it? And also, to be fair, if I'm running a massive manufacturing business, why would I know about this stuff?
Yes.
This is really not my business, is it?
Yeah.
To know about how to pitch a tender to get some investment.
Yeah, this is exactly. If you're running a major manufacturing business, but you now need to pitch basically a whole energy system on your site for a microgrid, you need to understand pricing for renewables, storage, the grid, then the carbon impacts, the operational. So it's a whole lot of stuff that's not your core business. And that, I suspect, also it puts a barrier up. People kind of, when you realize that it's so many things that's not your core business, you might be like, oh no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a very interesting one that we need to look at, because this is the key thing is, how do we get the money to the people who are trying to do the good things to reduce our emissions? Before we go, just so that the viewers and listeners kind of get an idea, the vast majority of our companies that we talked to they were all large users, to be honest, but we had a mix of percentages from manufacturing and the public sector, aviation, retail, and transport. And we also had quite an interesting one about the average annual energy consumption. And the sort of the majority, more than 50% combined, were between sort of 100 to 10 million, 100,000 to 10 million. And we had about a sort of 12% of larger age users. So look, thank you for taking us through those results. And as I said, people can have a look at that on the site and get in touch with Mark McDonald. We'll have much more to talk about. But just to end with, Rosa, we've got the new government. We've got a lot of ambition from this new government. We've got a lot of red tape, and we've got a lot of increased costs, particularly with national insurance. So in a way, we've got a government that's saying to businesses, we're on your side, we want you to decarbonise, and yet the other way, they're making things difficult. And you talked earlier about inflationary pressures. How do you see the short term being for businesses that are trying to decarbonise? Do you think they'll be slightly easier in terms of planning and policies to do that? Or do you think that you'll end up with more tricky regulation? And as you said, you know, the wording is good, but the reality can be quite difficult for businesses to do this. What's your take on things in these early days?
So just going based on what's being said in the manifesto and so far, I would expect that it's a bit more like what you said, that it's just getting a bit more regulatory. And there's, you know, Labour haven't said the plans to ask, that's the FTSE companies and large companies, obviously sort of undefined policy at the moment, but to put forward more specific plans on decarbonisation. So I would expect that kind of pressure, sort of regulatory pressure, to get stronger.
Right.
Definitely. Prices higher, like everyone is expecting. And in the short term, obviously, this hasn't been, you know, the government has announced in the budget a couple of sort of funds or continuation of funds that are sort of there's a sort of industry energy transformation fund continuing, and there's a sort of aviation fuels funding. So there's sort of bits of short-term funding that has been announced, for which applies also for ports, sort of infrastructure. So a few things that are like small amounts of money that have been announced. But I think if there's anything in the short term that government could really do is even set up a structure to look at this problem, that's large energy users and their impact on both the growth in the economy as well as decarbonising sectors like shipping and aviation, which are enabled by these ports and airports. And the fixes won't happen overnight, but at the moment we're really missing that conversation even, and that's why we wanted to do this and get this conversation started, and you know, try and bridge the gap between these companies and government.
What are you going to do with these results? What will there be more correspondence with our viewers and listeners? What's your plans now to go and analyse all this?
Well, we're actually more on the practical side. So our plan is, you know, we started the conversation, but we're absolutely engaging with our clients and delivering these, and particularly noting that on-site renewables and storage, and it's something that we talk more and more. Also grid, there's a sort of an overload of companies looking at grid capacity and applications at the moment. So it's people realizing that the problem is there, and if you need to get in the queue and you need to know what it is, because it's only going to get worse. So yeah, we're very much on the practical side, but I would would definitely support any sort of government and industry activity in this space, because it's a problem that needs solving.
Rosa, thank you very much for doing the survey with us. Thanks to all the people who participated. Lots of great work you're doing there. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you.